There's a huge difference between law and justice. Law says that if a person misses a deadline by a day, even though it's an innocent mistake, that person is going to be denied any relief in the court. That's not justice. Justice would say, let's look and see what happened and do the right thing.
The most difficult thing, at least for me, is I can, file motions, I can appeal losses, I can challenge your conviction, challenge your sentence. That's what I have to offer as a lawyer. But then ultimately, no court agrees with you that there's an injustice in the case and your client gets executed. It actually happened to 3 of my clients in a row, all within a 1-year period. You want to just lean out the window and scream, does anyone see what's happening here?
In 2009, we got involved in a case of a man who didn't have a lawyer, who was scheduled to be executed in 30 days. This was after the court had ruled in Atkins versus Virginia that you can't execute the intellectually disabled. And it turned out this man did suffer from intellectual disability. So I went to the trial court and said, you can't execute him. But the trial court said, too late. Somebody should have raised that years ago. I went to the state court. They said, too late. The appeals court said, too late. The federal court said, too late. We got to the day of the execution, and I was waiting on a ruling from the United States Supreme Court. Finally, the call came, and the ruling was that our motion for a stay of execution was due to be denied. And I then had to do the hardest thing I do in my job. I got on the phone, and I told this man, I'm so sorry, but I can't stop this execution. And then the man did the thing that I dread the most in my work. He started to cry. And then he tried to say something to me. But in addition to being intellectually disabled, he had a speech impediment, and he began to stutter. And in this moment, he kept trying to say something, and he just couldn't get a word out. And I didn't know what to say. I just was holding the phone. And my mind began to wander. And I remembered going to church one Sunday when I was a little boy. My mom had taken me to church. I remembered being in church, talking to my friends, and seeing this little skinny kid I'd never seen before. I asked that little boy, I said, what's your name? Where are you from? And I remembered how that little boy also couldn't get his words out, and he started to stutter. And then I remembered I laughed. And my mom saw me laughing at this little boy, and she came over and she grabbed me by the arm and she pulled me aside. And she said, Bryan, don't you ever do that. Now you go back over there and you tell that little boy you're sorry. After you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy. After you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him. And on the night of this execution, what I remembered was walking over to this little boy and saying, look, man, I'm sorry. And then I remembered lunging at him and giving him my little boy version of a man hug. And then I remember trying to say to this child as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, look, man, I don't know, I love you. And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back. And then I remembered how he whispered flawlessly in my ear, he said, I love you too. I was holding the phone and tears were running down my face. Finally, my client got his words out. He said, Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for representing me. And then he said, I want to thank you for fighting for me. And the last thing that man said to me, he said, Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life. He hung up the phone, they pulled him away, they strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. I hung up the phone, I said, I can't do this anymore. I was sitting there in agony, thinking about why I do what I do. I kept thinking about how broken he was. My clients have been broken by poverty, broken by disability, broken by trauma, broken by bias and discrimination. But what I realized that night that I'd never realized before is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. People sometimes say to me, oh, it must be overwhelming and difficult to represent people on death row, to be fighting against the system, and it is. The truth is that if you stand next to the condemned, if you fight for the poor, if you push against systems that are rooted and heavy, if you keep pushing and you keep fighting and you keep doing, you are going to get broken. What I realized is that I am part of the broken community. And when you realize that, you don't have a choice in standing up for the rights of the other broken. And so when I feel overwhelmed, I go into the conference room and I look out the window and I think about the people who were working here 60 years ago, trying to just create more justice. Sometimes I go to Dexter, Dr. King's church. We're at the heart, even the birthplace of the modern civil rights movement. And the images that we like to show of Dr. King are him giving these brilliant speeches about the moral arc of the universe. But the image that I think best captures his courage is the image of him in a Montgomery police station with his arm being pulled violently behind his back, where he's being arrested because he has organized a protest against racial segregation.